On this episode of Newt's World, in his 20 years in the Northern District of West Virginia, first as an assistant and then as the sitting U.S. Attorney, William Kolibash prosecuted all manner of crimes and criminals, ranging from old-school moonshiners who operated a massive marijuana ring, to sex traffickers, to violent Jamaican posses, to major drug dealers at the forefront of the cocaine wave. He also convicted the notorious godfather of Midwestern crime, Paul Hankish, and finished his career by bringing down the murderous and corrupt Swami of the Hare Krishna movement. He pioneered the use of the RICO statute to bring criminals to justice and became the first U.S. attorney ever to make use of multi-jurisdictional task forces and investigative grand juries. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, former U.S. Attorney William Kolibash, and he's here to talk about his new book, Justice Never Rests, a U.S. Attorney's battle against murderers, drug lords, mob kingpins, and cults. Bill, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this.
I mean, you've had a career that sounds like a series of movies. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, I've heard that. Several people who have read the book indicated that this should be a movie. And in fact, I have a call later this evening with a producer out in Hollywood who's read the book. So we may be going in that direction, sir.
That would be great. I'm very curious because you didn't start out to be a lawyer. What made you decide to go to law school and pursue this as a career?
Okay, I was graduated from Brown University in 1966, and that was at the height of the Vietnam War. And you had two options. Of course, they were using the draft number system, and I had a draft number where I would have been drafted. And so the two options that you had at the end of the year to get a deferment would be to become a teacher and teach in certain designated area, or you could get a deferment to go to law school for 3 years. So I was not interested in teaching, and several of my classmates were interested in law school, my fraternity brothers, and so I applied to law school as an alternative to being drafted or taking another course.
I'm kind of curious about the story about why you dropped out of physics and transferred over to history, because it's a very human story.
Yes, I went to a private military school in Wheeling, which has excellent academic credentials. And I did very well. I was second in my class, and I did extremely well in math and physics. And I thought I was really smart and could go in that direction in my career. And that was my first year at Brown. My second year, when things really got complicated, and physics courses and chemistry courses and all those types of courses required not only classroom work, but a lab. And I think the physics course was maybe 3 hours with a 3 or 4 hour lab. And I was walking across campus with a stack of books for the physics course, and I saw one of my fraternity brothers carrying a paperback book. And I said, well, what's that? He says, that's the textbook for history. I balanced the weight of each book, and I says, maybe I may be interested in that. I was interested in history when I was in high school, too. So that's how it came about that I became a history major.
So when you decided to go to law school, how did you end up at West Virginia?
I applied to several schools, but West Virginia was probably the one I thought I could get accepted to. I didn't have exactly a stellar academic background at Brown. I was kind of a gentleman C type student and probably had a better average in other curricular activities. And I thought that would give me a good opportunity there. And with my LSAT scores, I thought that would give me an opportunity with the background going to, a prestigious school like Brown, that I would have an opportunity to go there. And my family was back in West Virginia and so forth. We wanted to get back home.
So when you graduated from law school and you were admitted to the West Virginia State Bar, you were then offered a commission as a captain in the U.S. Army. Why did you accept?
Oh, it was an excellent opportunity, and it would give me an opportunity to do two things. One, to really gain a lot of experience in the practice of law, and then also to serve my country. In West Virginia, it's a very prominent in serving your country and things like that, so that's the reason.
When you were in the Judge Advocate General Corps, you actually had opportunities to experience trials in court much greater than the same opportunity if you were like in a big law firm. What was that like to be in your mid-20s in a military court in Fort Hood, trying cases that went all the way to capital?
Very great experience. It's a tremendous opportunity. And at that time, Mr. Speaker, what happened is the Military Justice Act, I think it was 1968, was passed, and it required that there be lawyers on both sides, on prosecutor, on defense. Previous to that, they used line officers as prosecutors, and they weren't that effective. So there was an opportunity to really get into the courtroom because you would have people with law degrees on both sides. And I did both sides, and it was a tremendous learning experience where you would study the law. One day you may be trying to get a piece of evidence on a search and seizure. Next day you may be trying to keep that out. So from an academic experience standpoint, you couldn't get that experience in private practice.
You have to switch your psychology. I mean, half a day you are a prosecutor, half a day you're a defense attorney. Those are really dramatically different attitudes and dramatically different arguments, aren't they?
Yes, it was challenging legal-wise. And, of course, the law was consistent. What changed would be the facts of a particular case. And then I also became the chief of military justice, which meant that I reviewed all the court-martial transcripts and did a review for the commanding general on what action, if any, he would take on those. And that was a very good experience for what later became an appellate practice when I went into the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So you really were getting a remarkable volume of experience compared to what would have happened if you'd gone into a normal big civilian law firm.
Oh, correct. Fort Hood was a pretty active anti-war installation. Jane Fonda would come down there. So we had a lot of difficult cases involving disobeying orders and things of that particular case. And I mentioned one particular one in the book where I was a defense attorney for an individual who was charged with disobeying orders. And I had to go into the Oleo Strut Coffee House, which was the hotbed of dissent, to meet my client in full uniform. So that's another interesting experience. I don't think you could match the experience that I got at Fort Hood, both militarily and practically speaking.
You get I think, remarkable opportunity. First of all, you're approached by the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, but that would take you to Detroit. But then luckily, an opening came up in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of West Virginia, which would take you back home. I mean, was that a pretty easy yes to decide to be an assistant U.S. attorney?
Yes, it was. It was pretty easy. And my background really fit in perfectly with what the U.S. Attorney's Office was. The Organized Crime Drug Task Force was obviously more focused on organized crime, criminal prosecution. But the U.S. Attorney's Office, and at that time there were only two assistants. And you had a broad range of legal actions, not only criminal, but civil action. And that gave me an opportunity to be familiarized with the full practice of law. But basically, before that, my focus was primarily on criminal cases and criminal appeals.
How much do you think that experience made you sort of approach the courtroom differently than you would have done without that?
I don't know what I would have done without that, because when you're trying a case, you can look at the law, you can look at the books, but you also have to develop that sixth sense when a person is a witness, how to handle a witness, how to do cross-examination, actually how to respond to a judge, and more importantly, how to respond to a jury. And that's the immeasurable experience that I got starting trying cases. Even though the military court is a panel of officers, it's a jury, and you're talking to people, and you're trying to convince people one way or the other of what your position is. So that's the kind of experience that you cannot get unless you're actually in the courtroom.
When you become the assistant U.S. attorney, what are your responsibilities? What does an assistant U.S. attorney do?
Well, in our office, I would handle some criminal cases. And back in the 70s, what we were focusing on pretty much is the property type crimes, bank robberies, stolen cars with the FBI, some tax cases and things of that nature. Civilly, we would be doing Social Security appeal cases, some Federal Tort Claims Act cases, representing some of the agencies if they had to go into court. and in civil cases. We did not have a real heavy civil caseload. Another area was condemnation cases, because there was a lot of condemnation cases at the time because there was dams being built on the Ohio River, property being taken, and that was a pretty heavy part of the civil docket. I did not do a lot of that. That was assigned to another attorney, but that's the kind of broad kind of cases that we had in the U.S. Attorney's Office.
You're now out of the Army, and the Army had a pretty good rule about not being politically active. But you have an interesting career as a Democrat and a Republican. Explain that just a little bit.
Well, growing up in West Virginia at that time, as you would be aware, West Virginia was a very strong Democratic state. Senator Byrd, Senator Randolph, later on Senator Rockefeller, and also the state government was controlled. I was not interested in politics, nor did anybody in my family interested in politics. So when I become the register, you register as a Democrat because that's the only party that was around. And, of course, you couldn't be active in politics in the Army, and I never was really active politically. When I would read the appointment as Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Democratic or Republican administration, as a courtesy to the U.S. Attorney, I changed registration as a Republican. It really didn't have anything to do with any political activity, of course, which I couldn't do anyway.
Then life changes and you end up as a Republican, and Ronald Reagan nominates you to be U.S. Attorney.
Yes, what happened there is in the Democratic administration there, the federal judge, there's a chapter on how he would try to manipulate things, never permitted the presidentially appointed U.S. attorney. He had a court-appointed U.S. attorney for, I think it was 4 years, whatever it was there. And then the Justice Department, the executive director at that time was Bill Tyson. He said the administration is not going to permit a court-appointed attorney. We're going to have a presidentially appointed U.S. attorney. And there were some candidates that were submitted who, for one reason or another, were not acceptable, but they did not want to take a side one way or the other. So Bill Tyson said, what we're going to do, instead of having the state submit a name, we're going to submit your name over to the White House and see what happens. And again, Governor Moore, who was the power broker at the time, was kind of skeptical of me because I had been a Democrat at one time for reasons unknown to me, why he would think that way. But then Mr. Prizer, Stanley Prizer, who was very influential in my career, he was one of the big defense attorneys in some of the corruption cases when I was U.S. assistant. He convinced Governor Moore not to oppose the appointment. And so with no opposition, the appointment then went to Congress, and I was appointed, confirmed, and appointed by President Reagan.
Now you are in charge. Hasn't it sort of surprised you how much West Virginia has shifted from the most Democratic state in the country to the most Republican in our lifetime?
Yes, definitely. As I say, I grew up with Senator Byrd, Senator Randolph, and of course I'm sure you're very, very familiar with the power that they've had. That was very surprising, but I wasn't really active in politics, and I couldn't be active being in the U.S. Attorney's Office, but it was really surprising to see the shift and see how it continues on. It's been really much better for the state. I think the Republican administrations have done an excellent job in promoting the state.
Now we get down to the sort of the heart of the book, and you begin your book with a really, I think, incredibly dangerous account of receiving a mail bomb from an inmate.
Well, some of these inmates who were doing time in state prisons, and state prisons were, at least in their view, were not a very nice place to be, and in fact a very bad place to be. And they, for some reason, thought that doing time in a federal installation would be much easier. So what they would do is they would commit a crime, a federal crime, and hope that they would be prosecuted. And then once they were convicted and sentenced, they would be transferred to a federal institution. Well, Mr. Hamrick threatened the judge, and we prosecuted him, but he found out that he was going to have to finish his state sentence before he started his federal sentence, and he was very upset with that and said he wanted to do something to make sure he could get out of state custody, so he ended up creating this bomb and sending it to me.
Luckily for you, the bomb didn't quite work. This must have been an unbelievable moment.
It was. I walked into the offices right after New Year's, and normally my secretary would bring the mail back, but she wasn't present that particular day. And we didn't have, at that time, there was no running the mail through any type of device or anything like that. And so I saw it on her desk, and I picked it up. It was in a legal-size envelope. It had an Oak Street address, is where the county jail was located. And we would get petitions from prisoners all the time, so I didn't think anything of it looking at the address. And when I opened it up, when I saw the butane lighters in there, saw some shrapnel fly out of there, I knew exactly what it was, and I immediately put it on the desk and left. And there was a long hallway between my office and the secretary's office, and went down that hallway and immediately called the ATF and the FBI.
How does a criminal in prison make a bomb?
This guy was very inventive, and there's a description in the book about all his activities. He did a lot of nasty things. He was a white supremacist, and he was one guy, Mr. Speaker, that I think was capable of assassinating a public official, high-level public official, even bossing up the president. And he got these items in the commissary, and a butane lighter. He got a legal pad. He got the shrapnel there. The way the bomb was constructed, he would shave down the butane lighters, and then he would have a wire connected to a 9-volt battery, and he would put an accelerant on the lighters, and then when the bomb opened up, that accelerant would melt the propane and blow it up. Well, he didn't use an accelerant that would do that, and that's what saved me. There were other things that he could have used at the commissary, which probably would work, but fortunately he did not do that.
Wow, that's a close shave, though. But I gather that you had a number of these kind of threats over the years.
Yes, but I don't think any of them were as serious as that. And what my concern was that I think in these organized crime cases, if they're going to do some damage to the case, they're not going to assassinate the prosecutor for the most part. They're going to go after witnesses. What concerned me most was when we started doing the crack cocaine cases, that somebody would say, somebody who had a vendetta against us or me would say, here's, 8-ball crack, go up and shoot that guy. That kind of random type person was a concern. Much of the threats from the organized crime people, I don't think there were any of those materialized where we actually were able to take some action and do a prosecution.
Do you think that if you're an organized crime, it's just not worth the risk of taking on a federal law enforcement person?
Yeah, I think so, especially in West Virginia. I don't think that any of those individuals would want to risk the repercussions that would come from something of that nature.
One of the things that makes your career unique is that you were a genuine pioneer in using the RICO statute. First of all, for the rest of us, what is a RICO statute?
RICO statute was passed in the 70s and was designed to combat organized crime. And basically what it does is it permits you to put a group of different types of individuals who are maybe running a group or a formal group, such as maybe a corporation, a business, something like that. Put those all together, and if those individuals are committing different types of crimes, which are called predicates under the RICO statute, and that establishes what is a pattern of racketeering activity, you can put that all in one particular case. You can put all the individuals in one case and all the crimes in one case. So you have a bribery, you have extortion, you have murder, all those crimes committed. And then comes under a RICO conspiracy, and there's also a RICO substantive statute. All the individuals can be tied together, and all the crimes can be tied together if they establish the pattern of racketeering activity. Before, you'd have to prosecute those, like a murder case individually, a bribery case individually with individual defendants, and you could not do that effectively.
RICO, in that sense, was it an important tool for you in going after organized crime?
Certainly. It was the tool because it gave us the statutory authority to pursue these groups and to combine them all in one large prosecution.
Your book talks about a lot of interesting, very different prosecutions. When you look back on it, which case is the most challenging, and what did you learn from it?
It's hard to single out a particular case. Of course, Paul Hankey's case in Wheeling had a lot of different tangents to it. The Hare Krishna case was another one. Those two prosecutions were probably the most challenging from an investigative standpoint. And I think the Jamaican cases over in Martinsburg and what was done when we cleaned all that out of there and how the community went back to being the nice sleepy community in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia.
You emphasize that if you're a U.S. attorney, it's really important to collaborate with law enforcement, and that law enforcement really plays sort of an essential role. Can you just talk briefly about the role of law enforcement from the standpoint of a U.S. attorney?
Yeah, one of the good things in the Reagan administration and Attorney General Meese is what they did. They asked us to form what is called law enforcement coordinating committees and to bring in all the different law enforcement agencies. Before that concept was being brought about, there was, I won't say distrust, but one of the examples was nobody wanted to work with the IRS because the IRS has all the red tape and stuff like that. Nobody wanted to work with the FBI because if we gave them a case, the FBI would take credit for it and things like that. But we dispelled all those rumors and stuff. When we had the first grand jury, we had the IRS working. Of course, they would do the financial part. We had the state police, and then we had the federal investigative agencies doing the other types of crimes. The first case we did was the marijuana moonshiner case, and it worked. We had support from the supervisors of the IRS, the SAC of the FBI, the superintendent of the West Virginia State Police, and then some local law enforcement. And once they saw the concept that worked, they say, this is great. We now can trust one another. We dispelled all those rumors and everything, and we've been successful. And the other thing, Mr. Speaker, was when forfeitures came into play. And back in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of forfeiture law. There was a federal, what is called drug law, continuing criminal enterprise law, which was similar to the RICO statute, but limited to drugs. It did have a forfeiture provision, and we used that in some of the earlier cases. But then Congress passed a lot of good forfeiture laws and money laundering laws, and that permitted us to do forfeitures. And, of course, those proceeds were distributed to the agencies who worked in the case. So there was a little extra incentive from that aspect.
When you look at all of the effort and time we put into trying to protect Americans from drug cartels and what have you, and you look at the fact that in the last couple of years, we've had more than twice as many young people die every year from things like fentanyl as died in the entire 8 years of the Vietnam War. From your perspective, with your extraordinary experience, what do you think we have to do to defeat drugs in America?
I think we have to form effective task forces. Once this concept was made prominent, everybody, the local, would form a task force here. What you need is a strong leader to put all this together. You have to have one person making the decision. And I always told my agents that you can tell me anything you want, I'll consider it, but I got one more vote than you do. And you got to have that cooperation. If you don't have the cooperation, you're not going to be successful. And I think we cite a couple cases in the book there where that cooperation was not there. I think the one in the Gotti case, that's what you need. Now, in the international situation, there are other interests involved, I guess. I mean, we got into that a little bit with prosecuting the Jamaicans. There was some politics involved down in Jamaica, and the Department of State came in, and so on and so forth. I don't know how, and you're much more experienced than I am, how you remedy those types of conflicts. You got to be a hard charger, and you just got to keep going and knocking things down. That's what President Trump appears to be doing, and hopefully he'll apply that to the cartels. And A.G. Bondi also, I think, is going to be very effective.
When you think about your experience and you see what's happening today, are there any kind of major changes you'd like to see in the way law enforcement and U.S. attorneys work?
Yes, I'd like to see more cooperation. We've got to have that cooperation between the Justice Department and the local U.S. attorneys. And I say the prime example of that is Attorney General Meese. He let the U.S. attorneys do their jobs. We didn't get a lot of interference from the Department of Justice. And you can't have that oversight from the people sitting in the Department in D.C. trying to second-guess U.S. attorneys out there. So I think that's going to come with A.G. Bondi. She's got all the experience, and she certainly has President Trump's support behind her.
I think that's absolutely right. Pam Bondi's a very tough, very smart person. Bill, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Justice Never Rests, a U.S. Attorney's Battle Against Murderers, Drug Lords, Mob Kingpins, and Cults, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And we're going to feature a link to buy it on our show page.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you to my guest, William Kolibash. You can get a link to buy his new book, Justice Never Rests, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.